This is number 40 on section 10.3, and what we want to do is we want to find the slope of this polar curve, r equals cosine of 2 theta, at each of the indicated points at theta equals 0, plus or minus pi over 2, and pi. So we know our conversions, x equals r cosine of theta, y equals r sine of theta, and we want to find the slope, which is dy dx, so that's going to be dy d theta over dx d theta. So first of all, we got to find x and then y, and then take the derivative. So x is equal to r cosine of theta. Well, r is 2 theta, so 2 theta cosine of theta, that's x. And if I take the derivative, I've got to use the product rule. Okay. First times the derivative of the second, this is negative cosine. The derivative of the cosine is negative sine, so I put the negative in front. Plus the second, which is cosine of theta times the derivative of the first, and that's going to be negative, so I put the negative in front. 2, for my chain rule, sine of 2 theta. So that's the derivative of this using the product rule. That's dx d theta. And then y is going to be equal to r sine of theta. R is cosine of 2 theta, so that's going to be 2 cosine of 2 theta times the sine of theta. And that's y. Then I'll take the derivative of this. Using the chain rule, first times the derivative of the second is just the cosine. Cosine of 2 theta, cosine of theta. Plus the second, which is the sine of theta times the derivative of the first, which is going to be negative. Chain rule 2, sine of 2 theta, so I put the negative in front. So there's my dy. So I just wrote it as dy over dx. So there's our dy. And here, dy d theta, excuse me. And here's my dx d theta. And I put the sign in front, just to keep it consistent. Okay. That wasn't consistent, I just did it like that, don't ask me why, okay? So at 0, so we have to put 0 in here. So the cosine of 0 and 2 times 0, that's both going to be 1, so this is 1. And the sine of 0 is 0, and 2 times 0 is 0, so that's just going to 0 out. So we just have 1 on the top. And the sine of 0 again is 0, so that's going to 0 out, and I've got a sine of 0 here, so those would be 0, so I have 0 in the denominator. So at theta equals 0, I have 1 over 0, so my slope is undefined, so I probably have a vertical tangent. Okay. At theta equals negative pi over 2, I'll put negative pi over 2 here, and the cosine of negative pi over 2, well, the cosine of 1 is going to be 0, so at pi over 2 or negative pi over 2, that's going to be 0, so that's going to 0 out. Now the sine of pi over 2 is 0, but the sine of 2 pi over 2, that's going to be pi. The sine of pi is 0, because pi starts here and goes back down. So that's going to be 0, so I'm going to have 0 on the top. And the bottom, the sine of negative pi over 2 is negative 1. And the cosine of pi is negative 1, so we have a negative times a negative is a positive. And then at pi over 2, the cosine of negative pi over 2 is 0, so that's going to 0 out. So we just have negative 1 times negative 1, which is positive 1. So we've got 0 over 1 is 0. At pi over 2, the cosine of pi over 2, again, is going to be 0, so that's going to 0 out. And the sine of pi over 2 here will be also 2 times pi over 2 is pi, so that's going to be 0. So I'm going to have 0 minus 0 on the top. And on the bottom, looks like the same as before. Pi over 2, the sine of pi over 2 is 1, so I got negative 1. And then the cosine of pi over 2 is going to be negative 1, so I got negative 1. I've got, this is negative 1 here, so actually it's going to be negative 1, I guess. Yeah, this is going to be negative. The sine of pi over 2, not negative pi over 2. So the sine of pi over 2 is going to be positive 1, and this is going to be negative 1, so I got negative 1. And over here, the cosine of pi over 2 is going to be 0, so that's going to 0 out. So I just have, again, negative 1 times negative 1 is 1, so I have 0 over 1, which is 0 again. And I just wrote these over here. I just wrote the coordinates so it'd be easy to kind of see what these are. This is pi over 2, negative pi over 2. So I should be using this because that's what I wrote it out to do these in the first place. So let's look at the last one, pi. So this is pi. And what's the cosine of pi? Cosine of pi is negative 1. And then the cosine of 2 pi goes all the way over here, and that's 1. So that's negative 1 times 1. And then negative 2 times the sine of pi. The sine of pi is 0, so that's going to 0 out. Don't have to worry about the other factor because if one factor is 0, the whole thing is 0. And then finally the bottom. What's the sine of pi is 0, so that's going to 0 out. And the sine of 2 pi, it's going to go all the way around there. That's also going to 0 out. So I've got negative 1 over 0, so that's undefined. Oops. So there we go. So using this little chart makes it a little bit faster, just so I don't have to do so much thinking. Okay. Hope that makes sense. I'll go back and check this one over here at negative pi over 2. So the cosine of pi over 2 is 0, so that's going to 0 out. And then the sine of 2 times negative pi over 2 is negative pi, and the sine of negative pi is 0, so that zeroes out. So those are my zeros on the top. On the bottom, this is going to be negative, and the sine of negative pi over 2. Negative pi over 2, the sine is that's negative 1. So I got a negative negative as it's positive. And the cosine of 2 pi goes all the way around as 1, so that's why we have negative 1. So let's see, is that right? So I got negative, and the sine of pi over 2 is 1 of those, so that's negative 1 times 1. That's right, which is negative 1. So that works out. So negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. It doesn't matter because you just have a number in here. It could be negative 1. It doesn't matter. 0 over something is 0 as long as it's something down there. Okay? So that's how you work it out. And it's just some arithmetic. You just got to watch your unit circles and put those in. And I could have done a little bit more detail here, but I was trying to save a little time. And remember, the more you skip steps, the more you have to think, so you have to be careful. Okay? So I hope that all makes sense. It's number 40.